we do is representing both owners and occupiers of real estate, whether it's amongst any one of the spectrum of responsibilities: owning, leasing, managing, consulting, loan investments. So where it comes into play with Jobs EQ is really for our occupiers of real estate and making decisions. I wish I'd heard the presentation this morning about talent, because that is the bread and butter for our clients. And so, this hopefully can give you guys some perspective on the flip side of the table of what we're doing. While I know a lot of you are on the economic development side or that incentive side, kind of where we sit at the table, especially when we partner with you on a lot of those efforts. So let's see if it works. Oh, beautiful, love it. I've been doing this about 15 years. I started when I was 5. I'm really advanced when I was a little one. But as we know, just in our own roles, let alone what companies on the corporate side are looking at the top level, the labor is important. And so the value of those employees drives the business. And so what I'm going to share with you is the life cycle of our process, how we approach the analytics, and how we sit on our side of the fence when we're trying to understand what they need to make their decisions. We want to make sure that the information and output that we provide shows what they need so they can understand it, because real estate is one of the most important factors and line items on their budget. So why do we need labor data? I know that's kind of, I'm speaking to the choir on this one, but that's how our clients make their decisions. That's how they inform themselves to make sure they're in the right spot. And it can get down to the granular data, which I'll show you a little bit later, of how it impacts their commuting and recruiting and retention. So just as an example for our overall process, when it comes to getting involved with making this decision, our professionals work with these folks to understand what do they want in their space, what the real estate need, how much they want to take, where they're thinking of being, kind of what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And then we start to talk about what else they need, what's not working. And so that's where we do a Q&A to really inform ourselves to make sure that we understand what they're doing. We then pull in all of our data, we provide our presentations and our materials, and then we actually present it to the client and work with them at that point to make their decision. Ultimately they are the ones that just choose their fate and make that decision, but we are hopefully that partner with them as they're going through that process. So in my role in research, it's always the question of when do I get engaged? Because our professionals that are representing the clients are the first ones on the ground. They're the first ones interfacing and talking with whether it's a CFO, a head of HR, an operations director, to understand their space needs. Then once the client actually mentions the kind of trigger of, well, we want some labor data, we need to understand where we can recruit, or if we're in the right market, that's when I get involved and I work with them to talk with the client and really understand what they're looking for, what's important to them. And so, as with anything, as early as possible is always ideal, because later in the game is not fun. Plus, as we all know, when you're pulling this type of information together, there are a lot of pieces that get pulled, discarded, pulled again, nuanced, tweaked, and, oh, I like that, can you do it again? Can you do it again? And so as long as I can be involved early, or anyone in my role can be involved early, that helps us provide the most and best information for that client. And so, we will allow, as much time as possible, and usually our clients are pretty understanding about just how long that takes, because they know to get it right, and this is a big decision, the time is necessary. So then, for us to be a trusted partner, we have to learn from our client, and that is usually one of the pieces that, if it's not the most important, it is right up there with being the most important, to understand what our client actually wants, because it is probably the most frustrating thing when the client goes, but that's not what I wanted, that's not what I was asking. And so we have to make sure that we understand their requirement to make it as smooth a process as possible. We have to remember our clients only go through this process once every 5, 10 years. Maybe if they're a multi-market corporation, they do this in other markets, but even still, we are educating them on the local market. And so what they've gone through in Orlando will not translate necessarily to Atlanta or to Miami or Jacksonville. And so we are there to make sure they understand the local dynamics, and then to understand what their uses are, because their operation in Orlando may be different from their operation in Atlanta. And so they're looking for different factors of their real estate. They're looking for different employees. And so this is how we get to do it. We use JobsEQ almost exclusively at this point, because we are trying to understand their business needs, especially from the labor side. And so we will also determine, based on what they want, the data that they're looking at, how best to display it. Because data is only as good as it's displayed if you can understand it. And so that's the important piece to remembering is, who is making the decision needs to understand what they're basing that decision off of. So as I mentioned, trying to decide how to present it becomes based on what you've been asked to provide. A lot of times the basic, first off, is I need to know where my employees are commuting from. And so we need employee addresses, because that impacts commute times. As well as then, if they're planning to grow their business, we're gonna start running some scenarios for recruiting potential, where like-minded companies are located, so that they can understand where there's a potential employee base, as well as if they want to relocate, do they have any areas of interest? Even within a market, they might decide, I'm right now in the central perimeter of Atlanta, but I really want to be in Midtown because it's booming, that's where the tech employees are, that's where the millennials are going, and so that's where I'm going to try recruiting my employees. And so they want to focus on that granular of a sub-market. And so we request information from our internal GIS professionals. A lot of times we will incorporate data from JobsEQ into our GIS systems to produce some mapping output that matches our standards, but a lot of times, it starts with what does the client need us to provide. So I wanted to give some examples of some options for what we're providing. So a lot of time, these mostly are going to be single market analysis, but what we are pulling together, we will replicate for multi-markets. And then at that point, we will actually pull together into a comprehensive analysis to be able, not to compare necessarily one market to another, but to showcase, here's the strengths, here's what you're looking for, here is how it scores based on the factors and the features that are important to you. And so, again, whether something gets weighted heavier or lighter, the client can make that decision based on their business needs that they may or may not have shared with us, because at some level they do keep things confidential. And so, as I mentioned, this is an example of an employee commute analysis that tends to be our first step in the process. We take their employee zip codes, and then we will map their commute times so that the client can understand how any move is going to impact their clients based on, or their employees based on their current situation. We will typically do this piece twice, sometimes 3 times in a process. At the beginning, where it's just the base, to understand where they're currently located, what's the impact? And then once they have 3 to 4 finalists for locations, we'll run it again so that they can understand all of a sudden, are they gonna have a disproportionate number of employees that are now commuting 60 minutes, or a larger number that just saw that commute time shrink. And this is an example in Atlanta. So if anybody's driven through Atlanta, we have no traffic at all. So traffic is important. Commuting patterns are important. And so this was actually a client who was consolidating an office location and their warehouse distribution center for what their business needs were. And they were trying to understand, for those 2 operations, how could they combine them into the best location, knowing that at the time, they were in 2 very distinct parts of the metro area, and moving them was going to have a disproportionate effect on their employees. It really depends on the client. I would say you could probably argue that in almost the majority of the cases, they're going to be a single market, just because there's a finite number of corporate headquarters or operations that are going to relocate easily. And so those are going to be a little bit different. I'll actually talk to in just a couple slides about call centers and how those are a little bit more adaptable to relocate because they are following the labor. But most of our searches are single market. So Atlanta has actually been benefiting, and given this example specifically, we've had a lot of new offices and operations open in Atlanta over the past 5 years, which is correlates with the job growth. If anybody's happened to see those numbers, Atlanta's job growth has been on the higher end of the spectrum for the major metro areas over the past 5 years. And so that has been a result of a lot of companies coming to Atlanta and creating new offices. But in the other alternative, we are seeing a lot of growth from existing operations. So as one example, Google just announced a pre-lease for a new office tower where they are going to be taking about 161,000 square feet. They had been in Atlanta already in about 80,000. So they're doubling in size as a current operation. However, on the flip side, you have Norfolk Southern, who announced about a year ago they were relocating their headquarters operation from Roanoke, Virginia to Atlanta, where they already had a presence, but they're going to double in size. So they actually are building a new headquarters. They sold their current building, but they will be doubling and bringing those employees, a large portion of those employees from Virginia to Atlanta. So, it hasn't been announced yet, but there is a coffee shop from Seattle that has been talking about a regional location in Atlanta. And so that's an example of a new operation coming to the market. So Atlanta's been benefiting and seeing both. So this map is for looking at the occupation data. So if we think back to the example of our office and warehouse client, operation client, they wanted to specifically look for accountants and computer tech workers for as it related to their warehouse and back office operations. And so, they were able to see when we highlighted their current locations as well as examples of potential options in other markets, that they were going to be moving to a more advantageous location for those workers. And so we do provide this exact map on a place of work and a place of residence location options so that we can truly see if people are willing to commute. Because Atlanta, as I mentioned, obviously has traffic, but every city, metro area has traffic, and that's a big, important thing to keep in mind is, will someone actually commute for a job? I don't know how many remember or were even impacted by the Department of Defense BRAC from 2005, the base realignment and closure. And at the time with that, the leased office space in the DC metro area was included in that analysis, as opposed to just being for the installations, military installations. And so there was a lot of discussion if people would even follow their job from Northern Virginia to Baltimore. And those, 40 miles away, it's not atypical, but it was a really big discussion for some of these agencies, government agencies, if their jobs would move, their people would move, or if they would have to hire and then all of a sudden lose that, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, institutional knowledge, thank you. That you only get when you've spent 20 years with the Defense Intelligence Agency. So, this map becomes really important for our clients to understand and truly quantify where they're going. I think a lot of you are familiar with, this what if report that we love from JobsEQ, because it just helps to give a snapshot to our clients to understand, is there available labor for it? They just like to be able to feel comfortable to know that where they're looking, there are people, and so they can do that. This definitely comes into play when we are doing a pure market relocation. And so when we have clients looking at, do I stay in Atlanta, or do I move to Nashville, or do I move to Dallas, this becomes key to understanding how it can impact their bottom line. The economic impact. So this allows our folks to truly get an idea. It's not the be-all, end-all, but it is the starting point discussion for understanding where those incentives can come from and how they can happen, and will they have a seat with leverage to talk about that with the local municipality or the state. And so this allows a good first snapshot, first look at that to understand, can we leverage our size or our operation or what we're bringing to the table to that community or to that county, and actually get some help in what we're trying to do. And so this gives a really good opening conversation for our clients that they wouldn't have had otherwise, unless they just kind of had already been through it before and they knew, we can do this, we have that leverage. So as I mentioned, call centers are a fascinating industry. We actually represent several, and I was very excited when I discovered this feature within JobsEQ, and probably got really unnecessarily excited about it, but it was fun. So clearly I'm in the right role when I get excited about the data. And so what this allowed us, especially for one of our clients who has over 24 call centers around the country, to pull this information for the different sizes of their call centers, because they did vary in size, to understand, are they in the right market? Are they in the right place? Do they have the right information? And so they could truly make that decision. And they found this invaluable to making sure that what the pieces that were important to them, with wages and availability within a certain age bracket, education level, that they were in the right markets, because they wanted to make sure that they had options. And not unlike other industries, call centers tend to be concentrated in the same markets because they're all pulling from the same labor pool. And so Phoenix is a huge call center market. Dallas is a huge call center market. You'll see Utah has some huge call center markets around Salt Lake City. So folks want to make sure that they are in the right markets, and one of our clients is actively actually relocating some of their call centers because they've discovered that there are better markets for that operation to be in. And so, and as I mentioned with the demographics portion for the call centers, we produced the map, a multivariable heat map, to showcase exactly where that confluence happens for those metrics depending on how they've weighted them, and so that it helps provide another layer of the best locations for their operations. And then another piece, especially depending on which industry they're part of, they want to know where their competitors are. So in this example, we are working with a for-profit university that is looking at opening a new operation. In this case, it was in Dallas, Texas. And so they wanted to see where their competition was. And they wanted to look at, in this case, it was for nursing programs. So they wanted to see how many degrees were being awarded, where they were located, and then for this, we also did the demographics portion so that they could see for their target students where they lived compared to where their competitors were based on where they were thinking about locating. And so, this became a really good snapshot for them to understand the market they were in. And this is actually an active project right now that we're undergoing. And the client is replicating this in the other states because this client happens to be in expansion mode. And so they are bringing new operations. They have just expanded in Tennessee. They're expanding in Texas. And I believe our next search is Atlanta. And so, this has become really valuable information for them. The client was really happy when we were able to present this in such a visual and be able to show them kind of where everybody is. So, at the end of it, it comes down to kind of what's important for our clients and what does this mean and how do we provide that value. And so, what we are doing is providing that concise data. We're the trusted resource, and we're providing the confidence for them for their future planning. And so they need to know that we're a trusted partner in this endeavor. I think the role of the real estate professional has evolved over the decades from where should I go, where's the space, what do I need, to now working with and letting the client drive the process based on what their operations entail, based on what they are looking for, their growth strategies, and really helping them fit the space to what they need. And I think it's really worked out well for us with this process. So I wanted to go ahead and open it up to questions because I know this is a different side of the table. This is a different kind of piece of the puzzle, maybe from what you guys have been doing or from what you're involved with. And so I wanted to go ahead and open it up and see how I can ask other questions.